This is a video about the GCSE Biology topics of extinction and the fossil record. They come up in paper 2 of AQA GCSE Biology and Combined Science as part of the unit about variation and evolution. In this video we're going to define extinction and give a variety of reasons why a species may go extinct, and then we're going to talk about what fossils are and how they form, and explain how the fossil record can provide some useful evidence for both evolution by natural selection and historic migration patterns. Extinction is the term we use when every single member of a species has died out. So for instance, my mammoth here, there are no mammoths left anywhere in the world, and so we say that mammoths have gone extinct. Under natural circumstances, this is a permanent event that can't be reversed, although as DNA technology progresses, it may be possible to reverse some very modern extinctions where we do have samples that contain DNA of a sufficiently high quality. Extinctions can be caused by various different factors, but they usually happen when something changes for a species. And we can divide these causes into biotic causes and abiotic causes. Biotic causes are living things, so it could be that the species has a new predator, either because this is an introduced species, like when humans introduced pigs to the islands where dodos lived and the pigs ate all of the dodos' eggs, or it could be because the predator has changed the range where it lives. It could also be a new competitor, like the grey squirrel that was introduced to Britain and being larger and stronger and more aggressive was able to outcompete our native red squirrels for their preferred food. And finally, it could be a new disease, like how Europeans took smallpox to America and wiped out most of the indigenous population because they had no natural immunity to a disease they'd never met. Now, those last two examples obviously aren't actually extinctions because not every animal or every human died, but you can see how they could cause an extinction. Abiotic causes are non-living causes. This tends to be where the environment around an organism is changing, and this could be a gradual change over time, like climate change, which could, for instance, make the organism's current habitat unsuitable, or it might be a more complicated process. So, for instance, if because of that climate change the organism's food source is unable to survive in its original habitat, the food source might migrate, and the organism might not be able to keep up with it. Alternatively, the abiotic cause could be a single catastrophic event, like a volcanic eruption or an asteroid collision. Finally, it could be habitat destruction, either because of climate change, something like the polar ice caps melting, or just because of human destruction, so how we're cutting down large swathes of the Amazon rainforest. Fossils are one piece of evidence that supports evolution, particularly of organisms that have now gone extinct. They're made from the preserved remains of organisms, and AQA say that they're from millions of years ago, which is not the same definition that everyone would use, but we're going to stick with the exam board for this. Now, they're going to be preserved in a number of different ways, and the most common is in rock, but there are other ways like in ice or in amber, and we'll talk about those as well. Fossils tend to be made from the hard parts of an animal, like its teeth or its bones or its shell, because the softer parts quickly decay. And this is one reason why we have very few fossils of the earliest organisms, because they tended to be soft-bodied creatures like jellyfish, and so there were no hard parts left to fossilise. Hard parts like bones and shells will decay over time, but they take longer to decay, and so it's more likely that it's possible for a fossil to form before they've decayed. That process of decay requires decomposers like bacteria, which break down dead matter for their food, and then those bacteria need oxygen for aerobic respiration, and also a temperature that isn't so hot it would denature their enzymes and isn't so cold that their enzymes won't work. So generally speaking, where fossils are formed, it tends to be where there either hasn't been enough oxygen for decay to occur, or the temperature has been too hot or more likely too cold. We'll talk through 3 ways that a fossil can form, and forming a fossil in a rock is probably the one you're most familiar with. That's the picture most people have in their head when we say a fossil. So the first step is that obviously the organism has to die, and then most likely the soft parts will decompose, leaving just the bones or the teeth or the shell. Now this third point is the crucial one. The hard parts are covered in sediment, so that means sort of wet sand, mud. A lot of fossils are actually formed under the sea, where the sand and the salt that is just kind of in the water anyway goes down and it falls on top of anything dead that's lying at the bottom of the ocean. It's not true to say that rock has fallen on top of the organism, and that's the thing that we see people writing a lot in the exams, but it's not true. The rock comes later. It gets made out of this sediment, so this mud or this sand. Gradually, the hard parts become mineralised, which means they get replaced by minerals. So the bones will decay eventually, but it's possible for them to be replaced by minerals first, and then we'll still see something that looks like bone inside the rock. And then over millions of years, then the sediment turns into a rock. The second option is not fossilising the organism at all, but fossilising traces it's left behind, like a footprint or a burrow or a rootlet from a plant. Now these are far less common because, as we've said, the easiest way to make a fossil is actually under the sea, and then there tend to be fewer footprints under the sea. But again, we've got the same process. So we've got an impression that's made by something being pushed into the floor, like a footprint, and then sediment has formed on top and kind of taken the shape of it, and it's gradually hardened to rock. The third option is where no decay happens at all and we actually get total preservation. So the organism has died and one or other of the conditions for decay has been absent. There are two clear examples of this. One is where you have fossils that are formed in amber. So say you could have a fly that's been resting on a tree and then there's been a crack in the tree bark and some sap has come out. And the sap has kind of ended up engulfing that entire insect. It can't fly away and it just ends up dying right there. And because there are very few decomposers present and very little oxygen can get in anyway, the sap is able to harden to make amber, which is a kind of orangey glassy substance, without any decay happening at all. So this is how you get fossils where you have, it's usually an insect, but it could be other animals, trapped inside a kind of orangey glassy amber. The second option is where a whole organism has been preserved, where it's usually died in a really polar region or maybe during an ice age, and the whole organism has been preserved in ice. And this has happened a few times. They found an entire mammoth preserved in this way, and we would consider this to be a kind of fossil as well, because it's still the preserved remains of an organism that died a very long time ago. We said that fossils are one piece of evidence that supports evolution, and you might be wondering how that is. Basically, by looking at the fossil record, we can see how organisms have changed over time, because we know how to age rocks, and we know that generally speaking the oldest rocks will be the deepest ones down. So fossils that are found nearer to the surface are expected to be younger and represent more recent organisms, and they tend to be much more complicated, whereas older fossils are found deep in the rock, and these tend to be far, far simpler. And these can help scientists to understand how organisms have changed as life developed on Earth, and that can act as evidence for evolution by natural selection. Another way that fossils can be useful is in showing us long-term migration patterns. So I'm not talking about a seasonal flying south for the winter, I'm talking about where an organism has changed its range over time, maybe in response to climate change or habitat destruction or something like that. So we could have a situation where in the far southwest of an island we find some really old fossils in some really old rock, and then some newer rock in the north of the island shows some slightly newer fossils. And that would provide us evidence that over a period of however many years it's been, those organisms have moved their range from the southwest up to the north, where maybe they've become better adapted. And this might be accompanied by changes in the fossils that give us an indication about how they've adapted to their new environment. We do have thousands of fossils, and they are really interesting and tell us a lot about how organisms have evolved over time. But unfortunately, we don't have a fossil for every organism that has ever existed, and there are a number of reasons for this. The first one is that those earliest fossils, those oldest organisms, were generally soft-bodied. And as we've already discussed, soft-bodied organisms tend to decay quite quickly, so before they can be turned into fossils. Really, the only way that we get fossils of soft-bodied organisms is if they've died somewhere that the bacteria can't decompose them. The second thing is that the conditions for fossilisation are actually quite rare. You have to have something that's staying in the same place and the sediment is just forming on top of it and it's not being disturbed, and then you have kind of the right temperature and the right pressure to turn it into rock, and that doesn't happen a whole lot of the time. The third thing is that in many instances fossils may have been made, but they may have been destroyed by geological activities. That could be an earthquake, it could be a volcano. And finally, there probably are quite a few more fossils out there that we just haven't found yet. And all of these factors contribute to us having an incomplete fossil record. Hopefully that all made sense and you're now ready to check that you've understood the video by answering a few questions. Here are the first 3 out of 6, so pause the video and write down an answer to each one. Fossils are the preserved remains of organisms, tending to be from millions of years ago and often found in rocks, although not always. The fossil record is useful to us because it provides evidence for evolution and also because it provides some evidence for long-term migration patterns. The insect in this picture was able to be fossilised because it didn't decay, and the reason for that would either be that there were few decomposers or that there was limited oxygen. Finally, here are 3 more questions about fossils and extinction, so pause the video and write down an answer to each one. Scientists have found very few fossils of the earliest organisms because, as we said right at the very start of the video, they were soft-bodied, and so they didn't fossilise easily because they tended to decompose before they had the opportunity. Even if they have fossilised, they're very old fossils, and so it's very likely that they've been destroyed by geological activity. The fossil in the diagram is one of these rocky fossils, so the dead organism was covered by sediment, only the soft parts decayed, and then mineralisation occurred. This organism could have gone extinct because of a biotic factor, like a new predator, hunting by humans, a new competitor taking all the food, or a new disease. Or it could have been an abiotic factor, like flooding, a drought, an ice age, or it could be a catastrophic event like a volcano, or habitat destruction. I hope that's been a useful video for you. Thank you very much for watching, and if you did find it useful, don't forget to like and subscribe using the button below.